Hey everybody, welcome back to another case study. So today we're going to be looking at the case of Libya to try to get an understanding of certain elements of U.S. counterterrorism policy. And so we're going to be looking at Libya, which used to be a state sponsor of terror, and how the U.S. has responded in different ways. As we talked about in our lecture, we looked at certain military and diplomatic responses, and we're going to assess those today in the case of Libya, see which ones were more effective, which weren't, how it might depend on particular contexts. So we're going to look at that more in depth with the case of Libya. So to start out and get an understanding of Libya as a counterterrorism case study, we need to first look at the origins of terrorism coming from Libya. And those really stemmed primarily from the individual of Muammar Gaddafi. And Muammar Gaddafi was the former leader of Libya. He was born in Libya in the early 1900s, 1930s or so, when Libya was actually controlled and occupied by the Italians, when Libya was an Italian colony. And Muammar Gaddafi joined the military and then ended up playing an important role in overthrowing Idris, the king of Libya, who had become the king of Libya after the Italians left and they had gained their independence. And it was largely seen that Idris, to some extent, was a puppet for Western European governments. And so Muammar Gaddafi led a revolution to overthrow the king and really install what he argued was going to be a socialist Islamic republic. And he really ruled, though, as a fairly brutal authoritarian leader from 1969 until 2011. He was responsible for killing numerous people, imprisoning individuals who disagreed with him. He was argued at the time at various points to be one of the richest people in the world, as he used the finances of the Libyan state to profit off of, make himself extraordinarily wealthy. But he was ultimately deposed in 2011 when there were uprisings in the city of Benghazi and other places in Libya that led ultimately to his ousting from power, especially once NATO countries, the United States, other European countries, Turkey, provided support to the forces that ultimately played a major role in ousting him from power. And he was ultimately found in Libya and killed by Libyan citizens. And this really ended his authoritarian regime. But Muammar Gaddafi played a pretty big role in sponsoring terrorism around the world, especially in the 1970s and 1980s. He really sought to try to destabilize any forces that he thought were linked with Europe, the United States, Israel, really tried to support and fund terrorism to try and counter these forces internationally. Similar as we talked about Iran as a state sponsor of terror, trying to push their particular agendas internationally. Muammar Gaddafi funded a lot of groups that tried to destabilize European, Israeli government, U.S. government, and forces that were more amenable to his particular agenda. So he sponsored a number of different groups and people who committed a number of terrorist attacks. He famously sponsored the individual Carlos the Jackal, a Venezuelan terrorist who carried out a lot of attacks around the world. He funded groups like the Italian Red Brigades in the Red Army in Germany, to communist-leaning groups, socialist terrorist organizations that sought to bring down the governments in Italy and Germany, and groups that were more favorable towards more of Muammar Gaddafi's socialist agenda. He funded neo-Nazis in Spain to try and destabilize the democratic Spanish government, who was hostile towards Libya. He funded Hezbollah, a group that would carry out terrorist attacks in Israel to try to bring about the end of the Israeli government. He funded the IRA in Northern Ireland to try to destabilize the United Kingdom's government, and as we talked about, the ETA in the Basque Country in Spain. So all these are really trying to fund groups that destabilize, harm countries he thought were hostile towards his regime. And so he even played an important role in helping to fund pretty significant terrorist attacks. The 1986 Berlin bombing in a discotheque that killed a number of people, including several American military forces. And probably the most famous attack that he played an important role and was responsible for helping to fund was what's called the Lockerbie bombing. And the Lockerbie bombing was a bomb that blew up in a commercial airline in 1988 over the city of Lockerbie in Scotland, killing over 250 people. Not only people on the plane, but when the remnants of the plane crashed, they ended up killing a number of people in the town of Lockerbie. And so he was seen as a major funder of terrorism, especially in the 1980s. And this led to a concerted response by the US and other Western countries trying to stop his funding and sponsorship of terrorism. And so, in this sense, there was attempts to counter. Initially, the main primary goal of the U.S. was to use military forces to try and counter Muammar Gaddafi's support and sponsorship of terrorism. And one of the things that they did right off the bat in the late 1970s was they added Libya to the list of states that sponsor terrorism. And once a state is put on the list that it sponsors terrorism, it no longer can receive any form of aid from the United States. It bans U.S. companies from doing business with that particular state, particularly without any. Companies can do business, but they have to get special permission from the U.S. Treasury Department, and so this rarely actually happens. So in some ways, this was an important diplomatic step that the U.S. took to try and pressure Libya into changing its behavior and stop funding terrorism internationally. But they continue to do so, as we see the two of many terrorist attacks that I listed both happened in the 1980s. So even though this does put some constraints, especially financial constraints, on Libya, it didn't ultimately stop them and deter them from engaging in their particular terrorist activities. And another thing, once a country goes on the state sponsorship of terror, the U.S. will also impose what they call secondary sanctions, which it will punish other countries as well for trying to do business with that country. So if particular European countries wanted to do business with Libya, the U.S. could take retaliatory steps towards those countries for doing business with Libya. So being on the list of state sponsorship of terrorism has a lot of negative consequences for countries. And Iran is on this list as well. So the U.S. also tried to take military action to try to stop Muammar Gaddafi's sponsorship of terrorism. In 1986, they carried out a number of bombings in Libya. They targeted camps where it was argued that he was working to train and provide safe haven for terrorist groups that would then try to carry out attacks in the United States, Europe, Israel. So they targeted that. And they also is argued in Gaddafi claims that the U.S. tried to bomb and ultimately kill him. They weren't successful in killing Gaddafi, but they really tried to ramp up their attacks on Libya in this concerted effort at airstrikes to limit Gaddafi's ability to continue to fund and train terrorist organizations. But as we see, this had limited success as the Lockerbie attack was argued in some respects to be a retaliation to the United States bombing in 1986. And Muammar Gaddafi's sponsorship of terrorism really didn't end even after these strikes. And in some ways, it was argued that this also helped and accelerated Libya's attempt to develop a chemical and nuclear weapons program. While they never actually fully developed a nuclear weapon, they did begin the process of trying to build nuclear weapons. And this was something they tried to do throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. And so ultimately, Muammar Gaddafi really renounced in a lot of ways the state sponsorship of terrorism and did so starting in the early 2000s. And there were several reasons for this. One, it's argued that the U.S. invasion of Iraq made Muammar Gaddafi, U.S. invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan made Gaddafi concerned that perhaps the U.S. had intentions of invading Libya, and he in no way wanted to lose power, access to the extensive amount of wealth that he had accumulated over time. And it was also argued that he was in significant financial trouble as well, based on continued U.S. sanctions, and that he wanted to try and get off the state sponsorship of terrorism list to try to normalize relations to increase economic activity in Libya. So what this ultimately meant, though, was the U.S. and Libya had to come to a democratic, negotiated diplomatic solution. And so what ultimately had to happen, though, was Libya came to the agreement that they would no longer sponsor terrorism. So Muammar Gaddafi signed an agreement that said that he would no longer fund terrorist groups anywhere in the world. They also ended up abandoning and dismantling their nuclear weapons and chemical weapons program. So this actually was fairly effective in ending that potential threat of the development of nuclear weapons and chemical weapons. And also, Muammar Gaddafi ended up admitting responsibility for his role and his government's role in the Lockerbie attack, and ended up paying out a significant amount of money, millions of dollars, to the families of the victims of the Lockerbie attack. So in this way, it actually ended up playing the diplomatic relationship, ended up playing in diplomatic response to state sponsorship of terrorism, played an important role in actually bringing about an end to terrorism sponsored by Libya. And so there are elements, as we said here earlier, that in the 1986 bombings, they did limit their capacity to carry out attacks for a while, but ultimately they were able to restart. But to highlight here, it again depends on the goals of a particular government when they're trying to stop terrorist activity. How military attacks can be effective in crippling a group's imminent capacity to act, but oftentimes you need fairly long-term, to find a long-term solution, you need diplomatic solutions, diplomatic agreements to try and end terrorism more permanently. So groups can sign agreements, have a mutual understanding, know what needs to be done, and start to build an element of trust that they will both go along with their side of an agreement to really truly end terrorism in the long term. So again, there's a pairing here of military and diplomatic elements. So I'll leave it there for now. Again, I think this is a good case study, but I wanted to end with the final discussion question of the day, and that is, should the U.S. government negotiate with states that sponsor terrorists? Why or why not? Again, should the U.S. negotiate with states that sponsor terrorists? Why or why not? As I said here, they did end up engaging in pretty extensive negotiations, but for a long time the U.S. was not willing to negotiate with Libya, and Libya wasn't willing to negotiate with the United States. So think about this for your discussion question, and I will talk to you again soon.